You are listening to the It's Your Time podcast, and I'm your host, certified life coach Michelle Arnold Burke. In today's episode, I'm sharing a recent conversation with trauma-informed expert and coach, Lindsay Poelman. Welcome to the It's Your Time podcast, the podcast where busy professionals like you get the practical solutions and support you need to gain control of your schedule so you can strive to be the best in your career, but without the stress and overwhelm. If you're looking to increase your energy and decrease your stress, you are in the right place. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the podcast, friends. Here we are at episode 180. And do I have a treat for you today? Today, I am sharing a recent conversation that I had with trauma-informed expert Lindsay Poelman. She is also a life coach and business owner. And as you know, every 10th episode, I love to share a mentor or a book or an interview. And this year, my word of the year is power. And this podcast is with a powerful woman and on a powerful topic. And it's so important. And I hear more folks talking about it these days. So I wanted to be sure you had some insight on it as well. Now, you might at first think, why is this the topic today? But the truth is, being trauma-informed, even at a foundational level, can truly help you make changes in your life, or maybe simply allow you to see things that are going on around you in a different way and maybe shed some insight as to where it might all come from. Or, honestly, maybe even help with some relationships in your life, personal or professional. And I've been learning more about this, I would say, over the past year or so. And I recently read a book, What Happened to You by Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry. And I think I've mentioned it before here on the podcast. And it really made sense. I highly recommend you check it out if you like what Lindsay is talking about, if something seems to resonate. Because the question is, what happened to you versus what is wrong with you? And there are just so many layers. And today, I just want us to be able to start the conversation, to begin opening up avenues of discussion in order to maybe heal and help more folks along the way. Now, you know, I like to set these episodes up as if you're just listening in on two women chatting, so I don't go back and really edit the conversation. It's like we're all just here together, and you are listening in. So, without further ado, please enjoy the chat with Lindsay.
Thank you
Hey.
so much for being here. I am so excited to talk about this because I do think it's a super important topic. But before we get into the podcast, can you just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your story, who you help, what you're doing, and why you do it, all of the goodness?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Poelman, and I'm a certified life coach. I used to work in public accounting and also in derivative accounting, and basically had a pre-midlife crisis. When my husband had his pre-midlife crisis, which brought upon my pre-midlife crisis. But basically, he had kind of a mental breakdown. I mean, some people, I think on the surface, it's really fascinating. Some people might have looked at it as like a burnout type thing. He was working as a dentist and whatnot. And on the surface at the time, it just kind of looked like he was kind of physically running himself into the ground. But then as we got things more stabilized and whatnot, we realized there was a lot of deeper stuff happening. Not only was there anxiety and depression, but there was childhood trauma and a bunch of stuff to work through. And so as we got him more stabilized, I just became very fascinated about trauma and also my own trauma that I went through with respect to his experience, which some people might be like, what are you talking about? Like, he's the one that had the mental breakdown. But at the time, because this was about 6.5 years ago, Michelle, and at the time, there just weren't resources available for spouses of people with mental illness. Like, there just wasn't a lot. And there wasn't a lot of resources for, spouses of people who like have addictive behavior as well. And so I felt like I found myself kind of clamoring, trying to find help wherever I could. And I did find a really good therapist who helped me with a lot of processing and grief work and things like that. But then I just remember a lot of professionals telling me like, this is it. Like, this is always going to be a thing. This is just, like for whatever reason, this is kind of just how it's going to be. And I just remember being like, there has to be more. Like, I don't think life is meant to be this space of like apathetic acceptance. And so I remember just being like, there has to be more. And then that's when I found a friend led me to coaching. And I got really turned on by it and got certified, and obviously have continued to be really fascinated by trauma. And now I coach coaches. Coach coaches on, how do I say that? I train coaches to be trauma informed. And I have kind of a relationship. I've kind of niched it into like relationship trauma training for coaches, because at the root of a lot of things is just usually a relationship, even if it's with an organization, an institution, an experience, with money and things like that. And so a lot of stuff in our lives is relationships, even if we don't know it. And so that's kind of how I've gotten here. I started out coaching women whose husband looked at porn, because there's a lot of betrayal trauma there for people in high demand Christian religions or high demand religions. And so I've kind of been doing trauma work for years, but then I just saw the need for, I guess what I saw from there is just the need for all humans to be trauma informed, so that we can approach whatever aspect of our lives, whether we're like, in a focused healing space or just, interacting with people who need to heal, just knowing how to approach all, different dynamics, different relationships, personally, professionally, spiritually, all the things.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because before we started recording, we were talking about how sometimes people start with you thinking it's one relationship, but then through the work realize that it was something totally different.
Totally. The stuff I'm working through right now, Michelle, I feel like a little blindsided.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nothing like, I think when we normalize trauma and we normalize, healing and just what our experience is meant to look like, it's not like this big, huge deal. There's usually just like deeper layers of stuff that come up, but it's kind of fascinating because some of the stuff I have been working through recently, it kind of like started with physical symptoms. And so I started looking at some books to kind of see where the potential emotional stuff could be, which might sound a little woo for some of your listeners. But anyway, yeah, a little blindsided.
It is. And I want to talk more about normalizing trauma also. And
yeah,
when you speak about the listeners, I do want to kind of just speak to the importance, right? Because oftentimes people on this podcast are probably here to hear more about work-life integration, time management, habits, sales numbers. So why do you think it is important that we're talking about trauma here?
Okay. Such a good question, especially for people who are working a lot, because like one trauma response that I think a lot of people, so an interesting thing about, trauma is like trauma responses are like usually pro-social responses. And so it's just kind of fascinating as you learn about that. One of the pro-social and even like a glamorized trauma response is like becoming a workaholic. Right?
Can you explain that a little bit more, like pro-social? What is that, like for the social benefit of others? What do you mean?
Yeah. So like a pro-social just means like whatever your response is, it's keeping you from doing whatever it is that maybe more being your more authentic self. They're usually pro-social responses, right? And so, hundreds of years ago, women survived by keeping their mouths shut, right? Women survived by being chosen by a man. There's a lot of deep rooted conditioning, and I would say even trauma that kind of keeps us in these pro-social trauma responses. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing too, because when you look at certain trauma, like behavior that comes from trauma responses, some of those behaviors are glamorized and some aren't.
100%, I would say in this environment, like the corporate world of device sales, especially, working a lot is totally glorified. Like you have a busy
Yeah.
badge of honor. People are always talking
Yeah.
about how busy they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's total. I mean, that's how it was for me when I worked in public accounting. It was like you hit 90 hours, you're like respected, right? And then it's like, but what is the cost? Like, what is that costing me? And, I think a lot of times some of the busyness is a way to just keep us from sitting and feeling and being in our bodies and letting ourselves like experience quiet. Um, and because that can be scary too. Like, wait, what's all this noise here? And for some people, they don't notice it till they like go to bed every night because that's the only time they're getting peace and quiet. And then they notice it and then decide to take sleeping pills so they don't have to notice it. Right. And so it can kind of like promulgate that cycle of not listening or looking or turning inward to see what's going on in your body.
That, and I think too, when I first started in coaching, it was actually to help women drink less, right? Because I feel
Uh-huh.
like at the end of the workday, if I'm not, the way for me back then to like slow down was to have a glass of wine, right? And then that kind of
Mm,
numbs everything else. So I think there's also
yeah.
people out there that will say that, like, I don't want to have to sit and think about everything that went quote unquote wrong during the day, right? So I'll just have a glass of wine or the sleeping pills or
Mhm.
whatever it is. And to your point about the overworking, it's so interesting. I was recently watching Alanis Morissette. She had a documentary on HBO Max, and she was talking
Uh-huh.
about how when she was younger and she would work until 5 a.m, everyone would
Uh-huh.
tap her how amazing that was. And she was so great.
Yeah.
She said, but if you think about it, if I told somebody I was up doing cocaine until 5 a.m, like that would not be good, right? Like
Yes.
glamorize the working.
Yes. No, I think it's so fascinating. And it's fascinating because too, I think I saw a Saturday Night Live skit recently that basically was joking that like, 20, 30 years ago, it was like cocaine that helps them write the skits. And now it's Adderall, right?
Oh,
And it's
yes.
like, and it was a joke, but it's also just like, okay, like why are we glamorizing destroying our bodies at the expense of an organization, right? When ultimately, like to keep the organization going, we really do need to like, start unwinding and learning how to take care of ourselves. And so that's why it's been really awesome to see some of these like, I don't want to say just female or owned companies, but I'm just thinking of this one specifically. My friend is interviewing to become like an editor for, and it's like this, 30-hour a week job. And they're just like, we know that you're more productive if you work 30 hours and that's it.
Wow.
That's it. Right. And so I think, what if we really think about quality and quantity for, versus like how busy we are, like the quality of work when after like hour 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, it could just be worth something for people to check in on. I know for me, working through the middle of the night, I was making more mistakes for sure, but maybe
Right.
not everybody.
Right. But it's just something to start paying attention to for sure. Now,
Yeah.
I know you talk about, and I feel like I've been in the coaching world for just 5 years now, but I think it
Mhm.
wasn't until last year that I actually started learning more about trauma, paying attention. And you talk about
Mhm.
big T and little t. Can
Uh-huh.
you kind of talk a little bit about that and what that means?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, big T trauma is like, it's the trauma that most people think of as trauma. So, like a natural disaster, a war, a big car accident, world event type things like 9/11, all of those things. That's kind of like a big T event. And little T traumas would normally just be considered, um, they're just like little things that happen that like chronic when something happens chronically over time, it can still be like the effects of little t can actually be as much or bigger than that of big T.
Do you have an
So
example of what a little t might be?
yeah, so it's really fascinating. And someone might be like, wait, what? No, I don't. Are you sure about that? But
Right.
like, so, and I remember the first time reading about this being like, wow, that's incredible. But like, so, little t could be like someone not making the basketball team in high school. Right. And you might just think like, oh, yeah, that's sad, but they just didn't make the team. But the thing is like the way that we're wired, the way that our brains work, yes, you don't make the team, but then what does that mean for you? And then what are
Mm.
you compounding with your belief systems over time about not making that team? And and basically stuff can kind of build from there. And so it's not like to scare everybody and think like, oh crap, like, well, there's no way to to eliminate this, but it's just, I think just recognizing like when we can have those little experiences and just know how to process and work through them as we go, they don't have to turn into these big bad things. And I think like when people are approaching, therapy or coaching, it also can be, I think it can just be helpful being like recognizing that it's okay to work through anything. And it's not an indicator of like how strong or weak you are, because a lot of the belief systems, for some reason, maybe that person not making the team reminded them of the time that, this other thing, when their dad moved out as an alcoholic and they were left alone or something like that. Right. And so there's lots of interconnections and things like that. But I think just recognizing like there are little tiny things, there are big things, but the effect of little t trauma not worked through can actually be equal to or greater than that of big T trauma, because we're not emotionally letting the emotion or the trauma move through our body. So it can get compounded over time. That
That
makes
is so
sense?
100%. And it's so fascinating because one of my questions, and I feel like sometimes when I have these conversations, I become more like, oh, it's almost like this vulnerable, like, oh, wait, she's touching on something. Because I remember
Yeah.
back when and I've been coached on this before, so it's kind of interesting you say it, not thinking it was a little T or anything,
Uh-huh.
but like not being, being picked last for gym class because I was a fat kid, or not being picked for cheerleading, right? But as you say, even how does that then go back? I wonder if there's something that is in there from like my biological mom not like keeping us, right? Like I grew up with my dad and my
Mm,
stepmom. So it's so
mhm.
fascinating for people listening that you might not think it's anything, just as you started that
Yeah.
answer, but really
Yeah.
pay attention to that. Because how do you think that might show up? I guess in ways now. So for example, would that also lead to maybe playing small in the corporate real world, not going for promotions, not going like, how do you see that then?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great question, right? Because if that is painful enough for you, you might not even apply for a promotion because of the perceived pain that you might feel if you don't get chosen,
Mm,
right? Or dating, right? It's like that if not getting chosen or not finding not finding whatever, it's like that perceived pain in your brain might actually feel worse than what it's worth to potentially like meet a life partner. Right. And so there's so many different ways it can show up, and it does show up in different ways. And so, and it's so varied and nuanced for each human. But I think just giving yourself compassion, being like, what if it's okay that it was just really hard for me? Because part of the reason that like little t, like the effects of it can be compounded is because of how we have been conditioned to treat people who are experiencing hard things, right? Like, suck it up, you'll be fine. It's not that bad. At least you have this. Look at those people in this other country. We've been conditioned to discount and like suppress all of our emotions. And if we just like let ourselves feel what comes up and let it feel incredibly hard and move through us, then we can just be more open to like, oh, okay, I can work through something hard, which means even if I like apply for this promotion and I don't get it, I know I'm going to survive.
mm.
Right. But when we don't work through it, we actually like our lower brain might not actually know that we can survive not getting a promotion. Right.
Interesting.
Or
Yes.
getting
And
ghosted or whatever.
yeah, and it goes back to again, right? The relationship is with your job or with the significant other. Like when you're using these examples, it's right back to the core of what you said.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you've also talked about therapy and coaching. Like
Mhm.
where do you see trauma, I guess, in those two avenues?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question, because here's the thing. Like, I think there's a big, at least when I started coaching, the big thing was just like, you don't take on clients carrying trauma, right? If you have clients carrying trauma, like you send them to a therapist. But the reality, Michelle, is that we're kind of all just carrying trauma. So, and the thing is, like, people don't know they're carrying trauma when they reach out to a coach for help. And even sometimes with a therapist, right? They just know they want some help with things. And so to be able to like truly handpick clients who have zero trauma, like, I don't even know if that's possible. And so the idea is like, what if we can have really good skills, really good tools, and things like that to help, like a higher touch, like more people, specific types of things, moving emotions through your body and and, being able to tease out certain truths and things like that. But then also recognize that there is like a subset that we definitely want to have a doctor or a therapist on the case for. So I have plenty of clients where, anytime I take on a new client, when I was doing my one-on-one coaching, I would do an intake call. And if I could pick up on trauma from the intake, I would be very clear, like, if they were functioning and if I could pick up on potential past trauma, then I would just be really clear, like, yes. And if it makes sense, we'll bring someone else in, right? Like, are you seeing a psychiatrist right now? Are you seeing a therapist? Do you have a therapist? How often do you see her? Like that kind of stuff. And so, but I think the big thing is just like the more that everyone can be educated about trauma, the more people will know where to go to get help. Right. So for me, I don't think of it as a fail if I think it might actually be really helpful for them to do some like integrative EMDR therapy. I actually think it's a really great thing. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yes, 100%. And I do think for people listening, when you talk about like high functioning, I think there's probably people listening today that are the busy people that are probably saying, I don't have time. I don't know what they're talking about, moving emotions. Like,
yeah.
where would you have somebody like that start to even become aware, I guess, of maybe what a trauma response might be or a trigger, or like even just to be able to crack open some light to like recognizing trauma that might be within themselves?
That's such a good question. And actually, even before that, like, I think that's why you might find a lot of high functioning people going to coaches before
Mm,
therapists because they don't think they have trauma. They just want help with like the time management and all the things and things and things. They think if they can kind of like work through all of these like problems, then they won't need, then they'll be okay. And these people need help too, right? But I would say I'm just thinking the best way. I think if you're just barely thinking about this and you're like, what does that mean? Like moving an emotion through your body, like trauma response. I think if you just tried sitting quietly for like 5 minutes a day, or like when you're driving, don't turn anything on for 5-10 minutes, just see what happens. Like see what
that
happens in your body.
that is
Go
such a
ahead.
great that's such a great tool, actually, because so many of these folks are on the road, right? They're in their car.
Mhm.
And so I know for myself, when I first started, I always had a podcast on, right? There was
Yeah.
always something else going on in my brain except for me
Yeah.
listening to myself. So I think that's a
Yeah.
perfect
Yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah. And so I think that's a great time to just kind of be like, wow, like how uncomfortable is it for me to just like sit with myself? Cause I remember it used to be like that for me. And now I really, really enjoy quiet now, but it wasn't always that way. So I think that's a great place to start. And then if that is anxiety provoking for you, then you could definitely, do some writing, see what's there, or, you could reach out to people like Michelle, who would definitely have, even more information or specific questions to help you get clearer for yourself.
I think it's funny you say the 5 minutes. When I'm talking to some folks and they're like, I don't have time to meditate for 2 minutes or 5 minutes. I'm like, then you probably should do 10, right?
Yeah. Well, and you actually bring up a really good point too, because like the thing is like certain people can't, every person is different with respect to like what can invoke, like what can be triggering. So for one person, like meditation can be their jam. They're like, oh my gosh, meditation, 10 minutes a day, it's everything. For someone else, meditation is like, can be very triggering. And so like having a coach who's trauma informed can help you find those grounding, connecting practices that work for you based on your nervous system, your specific needs and things like that.
Oh, that is such a great point. Cause I think I do look towards, because everything I joke about when I say, people listening, it's because that was me listening, right? Like those were my
Yeah.
thoughts. I was like 2 minutes for meditating, what? But now
Yeah.
I'm at like 30, 40 minutes. So, but I love that
Yeah.
you say that's not for everyone, because sometimes I
Yeah.
do feel like I think like it could be so hopeful, but maybe that's not accurate for everybody.
Well, and that's the fun thing too, is like when you can find a coach who's trauma informed or work with anyone who's trauma informed, it's like most people recognize the nuance of humanity. So it's like we want to help people recognize that their own nuance, like the power of their own nuance, and so that they can use their intuition to see what works for them. right? And I think sometimes when we get in these like, in the corporate world, it can be very focused on like right or wrong, numbers, busy, what's busy, what's not busy. And what if like, what would it be like to just like step back and start thinking about what's behind all of the things that you're doing so you can be either more clear about what you're all in for, or recognize that like maybe I do need to make some little changes. Maybe I do need to like spend 2 minutes walking, every morning, and you can start so simple too. It doesn't have to be this like wake up tomorrow and like become like a yogi, so.
Right. There's a little in between room in there.
For sure. Yeah. Like the radical change that we want comes from like super tiny things compounded over time. And so it can literally be, just extending the time between like a stimulus and a response, a stimulus being something that invokes that can invoke a trigger, and like you just responding to something. Like anytime we're just like stretching out that moment is like interrupting like a think, feel, act cycle or a trauma response cycle. So
That's good. And
yeah,
I think you mentioned, numbers. I feel like in this industry for sure, it's quarter to
yeah,
quarter, right? You're hero to zero. What have you done
yeah,
for me lately? Like that's kind of the
yeah,
go mentality. But to what
yeah,
you said earlier, like how can you work in that atmosphere, but as more of your authentic self? Like, do you even know what that means?
yeah, yeah. And like, let's remember we're not robots, right? And so I think sometimes when we look at growth and numbers, we get really linear. And our bodies aren't linear. Like the way our healing, like the way things happen, the way we experience life, like we have wintering phases, we have cycles where we actually do need to step back and just slow things down. And so, but the thing is like when you recognize that about yourself, when you can work with that, it doesn't have to mean you have to just like take 2 months of work off every year, but you can work with it and not judge or shame yourself as these shifting things happen. It actually reminds me of this. I heard the story and I'm pretty sure it's true, but I'm just like, should I even say this? But there was like a soccer coach who worked with women, and I think it was a male soccer coach. I don't know, male or female soccer coach who was working with a women's soccer team. And he started like scheduling the types of workouts with their cycles, because I think they're together so much, their cycles were the same.
Oh,
Right.
interesting.
So there were like certain stretches where they might do like maybe more yoga, and certain parts where they do more sprinting and things like that. And they ended up like winning some championship of some sort. But it's like the more we just know ourselves, instead of getting into this like robotic, busy number thing, like what if we can understand ourselves, understand our body, understand what it needs, and trust. I know this might sound like a big reach, but like develop the skill or the mental, like that mental ability to trust that like you can still be really successful, and you can still be sustainably like successful,
Yes, I think that was one huge lesson for me. One of my coaches had said, you need to slow down in order to speed up. And I felt my
Yeah.
heart race when she was talking about slowing
Yeah.
down. Like, what do you mean
Yeah.
slow down? But it's
Yeah.
everything, because you become so much more intentional, not only in your job, but in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it matters. And it's fun. I mean, it's always fun to hear those like victory stories, like the soccer team figured it out and then they won a championship, right? And I think just getting to a space where whatever matters for you is what you're getting to, even if like externally it hasn't been, you don't see it yet. Cause I think sometimes we get so focused like on wanting immediate external validation or an external like proof that what we're doing on the inside is working. And it's not always exactly that way as you're kind of learning to switch this up, but it's definitely available, definitely possible. And there's just so many different ways to like start looking at yourself, what you need. I mean, to me, it's everything.
Yeah. And actually what matters, right? Like what matters to me.
Yeah.
I think so many women don't even give themselves the time to think about that
Oh
question.
my gosh. Yeah. Like that's when I used to do my one-on-one coaching, it's one of the earlier questions I would ask people, like, just when they would reach out, like, yeah, so like, what is it that you need? And they were like, I don't know. What? Me? Me?
I'm laughing because when Karen, who we both know, asked me that, I was like, that seems like a really tough question. Like, what?
Yeah. 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 And
Yes.
that's the thing too, is like, that's been totally conditioned out of us to like think about what we want, what we need. And the thing is I do believe that as women, and I don't know if most of your audience is women or men, but I'll say women or men, like us figuring out what our unique gifts are and putting that into the world, like is the thing that the world needs, if you even want to focus on what the world needs. But I think like just being willing to like look inward and see what you need, what lights you up, like what is going to help you sustainably do what it is that you want to do every day. Like it really, really does matter. Because we need like, I mean, I guess just from like a male female perspective, we need women like putting forth stuff too, and like putting forth their most unique divine gifts too, and being seen, being willing to be seen. And we need that from men as well. But I think a lot of times we've just been so conditioned to be so busy, we're not even thinking about how powerful we are, you know?
100%. And you're talking about conditioning. I also want to make sure we go back to normalizing and kind of as we're unlearning, learning. And I
Mhm.
recently read that book. I think speaking of normalizing, Oprah, right? Like everybody knows
Oh yeah.
Oprah almost.
Love
I
her.
would think everyone. But
Yeah,
I
she's the
read her
best.
book with Dr. Perry, What Happened to You?
Uh-huh.
And so I feel like maybe that also was another avenue for me to be like, oh, wait, maybe it's also here and here and here. Like, what are your thoughts around normalizing? Like, what does that mean? Um, and I guess what would you suggest for folks to do in order to be more open to normalizing it, unlearning maybe what it is that we've learned?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think like individually, we've kind of been taught that like if we're not getting, if we're not hitting numbers, if we're not doing the things, that there's something wrong with us, right? What's wrong with you? And I love that book so much because the premise is like, why are we when foster kids are coming in, into like these therapists' office and whatnot, what if it's not like what's wrong with him? It's like, what happened? Like, what
Mm,
happened? Right. The reason we are who we are today, the reason that we show up in the way that we do, or we don't show up in the way that we want to, comes from so many internalized experiences that we had from like literally the womb, but like childhood stuff we've internalized from the external environment, all the things. And so we've all just internalized so much, and our brain interprets that in a certain way so that we show up in a certain way. And so I think when we just recognize that, like, the stuff that comes to our consciousness and to the surface, like it's all normal. And if we're carrying stuff, it's normal. Like everything that you're saying or thinking is totally okay. And I think just helping people see is like if you're just barely starting to think about this stuff, like really making it clear that like you aren't your thoughts and feelings. Because sometimes when we start letting the thoughts come up, there's just like a huge shame storm. And so just know like a lot of the stuff that is coming up is stuff that we internalized when we didn't even know we had a choice to be like, I don't want to buy into that body shame business. Like, no, I don't
mm,
think so. I'm going to say no to that. We didn't know we could do that when we were kids or teenagers. And so anything that is coming up with respect to how we judge ourselves or judge others, like as you slow down and stuff comes up, just let it be okay. You just get to be this curious observer, like, okay, this is here. I don't like it. How can I just like see that it makes sense that it's here so that I can work with it and decide what I want to discard or keep or prune or nourish or whatnot. But I mean, the reality is we are all humans. We've all experienced trauma to some degree. And the more that we can normalize that, the more we can show up personally and professionally to support people doing the same things or people who have experienced trauma as well. And so it just makes a difference, like when you are, whether you're like a CEO, like I think we'd have so much more understanding for employees that are going through things or why people are late all the time or whatnot versus, if you're trauma informed versus like if you're not trauma informed, right?
mm,
And I'll just say personally, like when I was going through all my stuff with my husband, because he'd been lying to me about his porn use, and then he told me about it, and then he suddenly stopped working, and then he had all this childhood trauma that he was working through. He had to stop working. So all this stuff is happening. He's realized he's been like sexually abused. He's totally non-functioning. I had like a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a baby. And then I had to start working again. And my employers, Michelle, I was in a fog. Like it was a really nice distraction, but it was still pretty foggy. And I remember getting through like a really horrible tax season and just like, I feel like I got probably pretty average, like, what is it, like average reviews, but average to a perfectionist sucks.
Mm.
And so I got, average, maybe like a little bit above average reviews or whatever, but to me, it totally sucked. But and I actually ended up needing to take like a 3-month sabbatical just to be with my kids because I hadn't seen them for so long, like seen them a lot as much as I wanted to. But like the way those partners like worked with me, like I will never forget that. Like it wasn't like, whoa, you have a lot of stuff happening. I mean, just kind of figure it out. Like they were like, oh, wow, you have a lot going on. Like, let's give you a sabbatical. We're going to treat it as a maternity leave. Like, go take care of yourself. Like
Wow.
that stuff matters. And for me, I'm like, okay, like you guys will be my clients again someday because they care about their people and like, what they're actually going through. And it like was just really touching to me, especially coming from like that was in public accounting. It was a regional public accounting firm. My first one was like a Big Four, but this regional one, like the specific partners I had, like I just remember I'm just like forever grateful because that stuff really matters. And I think it's because of, whatever experiences they have gone through or had not gone through, or just their understanding of actual real humans and how to treat them just made a really, really big difference.
Yeah. And it sounds like the normalizing is not just within ourselves to normalize that it's okay, but normalizing it so the way we interact with the others is what you're saying also, right? It's like
Yeah.
for ourselves and for
Yeah.
others.
Yeah. So you can support people. And then if someone is like blowing up at you at the grocery store, do we blow up back or do we just like, wow, like this response isn't like the relationship of this response versus like this reaction versus what happened, like something's off there. Of course we set boundaries, like, and that's the thing too, like the more we are trauma informed, we can set really appropriate boundaries, but we can also not take it on, like take stuff on. Right. And so for me, that's another thing too. Like I'm really clear with my kids, like what's theirs, what's mine. If I overreact, it's not because of them. Right. Like I just think it can really matter in those situations too, and how we treat peers. And there are a lot of doctors who like, there are people who are carrying trauma who go to doctors for help. And the doctors, they're so niched into wherever they are that they actually aren't always aware that like, that this past trauma could actually be affecting their like irritable bowel syndrome or whatnot. Right. And so
Oh,
the
yes.
more, when you can find trauma informed doctors, it really makes a difference. Like my husband had like a neurologist who was trauma informed that really helped him get like the right books, the right reading and things like that to see the stress and everything behind it versus just like, oh, you're not sleeping. Here's some pills. Right. And so it makes a difference like everywhere you go.
100%. I see that. And this could be a whole rabbit hole that I won't go down, but I feel like even with my patients, right? I work with pain
Yeah.
patients. So that's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff that could be held in the body,
Yeah.
talking about that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Like there's a ton of like, there's so much research that proves that like a lot of autoimmune diseases, and like, I can't remember if chronic pain is part of it, but like a lot of autoimmune fibromyalgia is usually linked to trauma. And, even, some people might think like when I say the trauma that I went through with my husband was like something I would call betrayal trauma. And a lot of people, especially like newer coaches or people who aren't trauma informed, they might be like, what are you talking about? Like you're traumatized because of what? Like that just seems so little. But like there's a lot of research that shows that like a lot of women who have experienced betrayal trauma to some respect have like autoimmune stuff. So if you're an autoimmune doctor, like how impactful could it be if you recognize that so that they can also be getting like psychological help that they need while you're treating them,
Oh, yes. There's so much. That is so good because I feel like, yeah, this is just like the tip of the surface of all of the information that you have. I love that you talk about just becoming aware of it to be able to start pruning, right? Past
Uh-huh.
trauma that maybe you didn't even realize you had, to be able
Yeah.
to step more into your power and to be able to show up in a bigger way, which is the
Mhm.
ripple effect, right? I always talk about the ripple effect we have here. And I think that seems like such a good place to kind of bring it back to, is just having given yourself the time. It sounds like you're talking about grace, compassion, courage, curiosity, to really
Mhm.
get clear on how you want to show up.
Yeah. And I think, like show up in a way that lights you up, right? That's like exciting for you, where you're excited about waking up, whatever it is that you're waking up to or waking up to do like that. I think we're here to like be in touch with ourselves enough to like access our creativity and put that into the world. And when I say access our creativity, that doesn't mean turn us all into artists. Like it means people like you doing what you're doing, right? And other people doing what they're doing, because we're all just so unique and different. But I really do think it matters, and I think people are ready for it. I really
Mhm.
do.
I agree. And I love your quote before we started. What did you say? It's fun to be alive right now. Is that what you?
I said something about that.
Right. Right.
Yes. Like, what's the point if we aren't
100%.
enjoying things, right? And if we like can't turn off at night, like what if we need to like, what if we could treat ourselves in such a way and like work through whatever's there so that like whatever our coping mechanisms are or whatever we're like numbing out with at night becomes irrelevant if we want it to become irrelevant, right?
Right.
My husband helps men stop looking at porn. And he always says, like, learn to love your life so much that porn becomes irrelevant. And like, it doesn't. And I just like that idea that, like, what if then when we have the wine, it's just because we want a glass and we're not trying to forget about everything. Right.
Yes. 100%. Yes. And I love that we can talk about trauma and also talk about loving to live life and having fun, right?
Yes.
It can be and, not or.
Yes. And I think that's like my big thing too, is like, I do a lot of this work with women. Like I've been doing it for 4 years, and some people will look at me like, oh, it's so heavy. Like, how do you do that? The thing is like people are walking away lighter and freer. Like we are like working through your trauma is freeing yourself. It really is. And it's like helping people be free enough to let their true selves be seen in the world. And I don't know if there's anything more important than people being grounded and feeling safe enough to just let themselves be seen for who they are.
I, I was just going to say, we need more of that for sure, for people to be seen as who they are. How
Yes.
can people find you? Like, where's the best place to watch, follow, connect, all
Oh
the
yeah.
good stuff,
All the things. So I'm
all the
on
things?
Instagram. I'm on Instagram as Lindsay Poelman Coaching. It's Poelman. And then I just have a website, lindsaypoelmancoaching.com. So I do self-advocacy groups for women frustrated with their husband's porn habits, porn use. I have a self-advocacy master's that's going to come out like later on this year for more of a broad self-advocacy thing. But then I also train coaches how to be more trauma informed.
Oh,
So,
that's great.
and then I do like private one-off stuff for like entrepreneurs or business owners who want to learn this stuff specific for their company too. So,
Okay, great. And I'll
yeah.
put all of the links in the notes. Thank you
Yeah,
so much. This has
of
been so
course.
informative.
It's so wonderful to see you, Michelle. And I love the work that you're doing. And that's the thing. It's like, if you guys are wondering, where do I start? Start with Michelle. She knows what she's doing. She knows, I think plenty to really help people dial into this for themselves too, for sure.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, how about a couple of those last quotes? Do things that light you up. It's fun to be alive right now. Such great thoughts. I'm totally taking them, and I think you should too. There's just so many facets to think about around this topic. Maybe to add some empathy and compassion, perhaps in the world, in your world, at least, right, for yourself. Now, I also want to let you know that Lindsay has given us a worksheet that she uses with coaches for their clients. It's called 10 Signs Your Client May Be Experiencing a Trauma Response. And she's giving it to us. I think it's a great tool to just look at what some responses might be, maybe for yourself or a family member or a team member or even a customer. I'm going to add the link in the notes. Now, again, It's geared towards coaches, but honestly, we can all learn from it. So be sure to check it out. I will also have Lindsay's links in the notes for you to be able to learn so much more if you follow her. Lindsay Poelman Coaching on Instagram, and then lindsaypoelmancoaching.com if you want to check out her website. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Let's circle back next week. For now, let yourself be seen and make it a great day. Take care. Did you know you can take this work to a deeper level with me one-on-one? Go to michelleburkecoaching.com and click on Get Started to begin.